Hi, everyone, and welcome.
Hi.
Christina Chiang, Creative Partnerships State Manager for New South Wales and ACT. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and on behalf of Creative Partnerships Australia, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, learn and work as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and to our shared future. Thank you for joining us from the various lands you're beaming in from for creating an action-led arts fundraising plan, the first of 5 webinars in our latest knowledge series. There was a great response to the first series, and while we dearly wish circumstances were different for those of us navigating another week of lockdown, we're pleased to be able to extend our capacity building offering in this way. This particular series focuses on strategies, insights and tools to continue building your arts fundraising expertise. Following today's building blocks of fundraising readiness, the rest of the series will delve into major gift cultivation and understanding donor behaviour to create better relationships, board stewardship and the critical role they play in fundraising success, and the potential of machine learning and AI to help arts organisations become more effective fundraisers. You can, of course, check out the Creative Partnerships website for more information and booking details. Now, for a bit of housekeeping, please remain on mute unless speaking, and you're welcome to leave your cameras off throughout the session. For any technical issues, please direct message my colleague Catherine in the chat box. There will also be a Q&A at the end, so as I'm sure you're all familiar with, feel free to type your questions into the chat box as we go, or send them directly to me and we'll facilitate that discussion at the end. And a reminder that we are recording today's session. A copy will be emailed to you in a week's time. We're thrilled to have the wonderful Frankie Airey kick off this series. Some of you are no doubt familiar with Frankie, but by way of background, she is Director of Philanthropy Squared, a management consulting firm specialising in development strategy for the non-profit sector. She began her impressive career with the groundbreaking campaign for Oxford University. Since then, she has worked as a practitioner and consultant with many leading universities and cultural institutions, both here and in the UK. Frankie has served on several boards, including Sadler's Wells Theatre in London and the Malthouse Theatre in Melbourne. Currently, she's chair of the wonderful Betty Ansden Foundation and a trustee of Arts Centre Melbourne. We'll benefit from Frankie's impressive experience in philanthropy with her focus today on donations and trusts and foundations. But many components will be relevant to corporate partnerships, particularly organisational readiness. But for those of you keen to delve more deeply into partnership strategies, feel free to follow up with your state managers for further insights. Creative Partnerships is also offering a free business partnerships growth workshop for select organisations. Expressions of interest are currently open and close on the 15th of October. Again, more info on the Creative Partnerships website. But for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Frankie.
Thanks very much, Christina. And hello, everybody. I can't see you, but you can see me, and you're all most welcome. Excuse me. So today I'm going to be talking to you as much a passionate sort of plea for more planning, as well as sort of a practical look at how do you plan and what kind of things you do look at for the planning. So just to start with, chaos abounds, I think, in many of the organizations that we work with, and certainly our knowledge around the sector. Boards have strong opinions about fundraising, what it is, what it should be doing, how it should be doing it. CEOs are under pressure from their boards to raise more funds more quickly. Chief financial officers want funds to come in perfectly tight little bundles with absolutely no strings attached. Fundraisers have a calendar of activity. If only they were able to get on with it and didn't have to write position papers or business cases for the powers that be to let them do it. I wonder if this sounds familiar to all of you. Common to all of these, including the fundraiser, is the sense that fundraising is a doing thing, something that you only need to think about when setting next year's targets with a blanket 15% increase because the costs have risen. I often think it's treated like it's a technical problem rather than a strategic one, and certainly not an adaptive one, where the whole organization needs to actually take a look and think about how do we work in this sphere. So I'm a strategist. I'm a natural planner. It's the way I think, and I've been a practitioner, working in the university sector. And then when we first arrived in Australia 20 odd years ago, I was working at the Arts Centre in Melbourne. So I've worked in the arts as well. And I've just known all along, each time I've left a place or worked in a place, I thought, gee, we've raised so much money, but we could have done so much better if the organizational framework was in better shape and would actually let us do our job. And so that's been our focus as consultants, is to look at the organizational framework. How do you create a culture of philanthropy? How do you turn an organization from an organization that fundraises into a fundraising organization? Because when all of the different pieces work together, then you get such a better result, such a better response. And I've doubtless used many metaphors because they pop into my head at random. But one of the things that I often think about is if the whole orchestra is like that, the whole organization is like an orchestra. And when each instrument is playing at the right pace, in the right time, and the right music, then the ultimate sound is really beautiful. But often you find in fundraising that we're the equivalent of the viola, I think, that doesn't get the oxygen, that is expected to just provide some background texture, and doesn't apparently seem to be crucial to who we are and what we do. And so just approaching fundraising as an operational planning thing, to say, how do we look at next year, and who's going to give us the money and how do we get it from them? That's fine, that needs to be done. But if we don't actually think, how does this link in and what do we need from others in our organization, and use the planning process as a way of educating everybody around us about what we need from you in order to really fly, then I think we've missed an opportunity. So as a strategist, I came across this quote some years ago, and I love it. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And in fundraising, we use far more tactics, and we're pressured to use tactics, I think, rather than actually that strategic approach. And we really need them both. I often think that, the tactics in fundraising, the different operational or programs that we apply, or different campaigns, they can go off like a firework display. They're beautiful while they happen, but they end in darkness. And that's tactics without strategy. But strategy is actually the steady light that you get, even if it's only from a candle. It's actually a steady light, so that the light can build over time. There you go, another metaphor. Let me just, working from home as we all are these days, it's one has to multitask. So the first thing to think about, as I say, that the first half of my presentation is actually about the sort of organizational context and the things we should think about before we start planning, provide us the background as to the practical aspects of what we should be doing to really capture the information so that we can make the decisions about what's next. And in fundraising, the first thing really to think about is, who is your market and what do they want and what do they need? As Christina said, our focus is primarily on the philanthropic side, but the way of sort of impacting and interacting with the corporate sector, there are many synergies, obviously, and many similar ways of approaching. But broadly, the three sources of private support for the nonprofit sector, for the arts, are foundations and trusts, corporations, and individual donors. So all of them, in their interaction with the nonprofit sector, are looking for impact. They're looking to change the world, to turn the dial, to make things look better tomorrow than they look today. But foundations, the philanthropic decision's already been made by the donor. whether you're talking the Meyer family, the Potter family, the Valnaves, the Betty Amsden Foundation, the donor has made the decision and there's a giving vehicle. So from a fundraiser's perspective, you know this person or the people behind this have actually flagged themselves as being philanthropic. And so, you know, the process of actually looking for which organizations or which foundations actually give in your sector, give to the type of organization that you are, give to the type of program that you run. There's solid research, and then there's crafting an appropriate sort of submission. It's important to know the people, it's important to know and talk to an administrator or a director if there is one, and if we can talk to have some access to the trustees, great. But actually, as I say, the giving decision's already been made, so you know what they're trying to achieve with their giving, and you know whether or not you can match it. Generally speaking, foundations look for leverage. They like the idea of leverage, that their funding can actually unpack others. So, for example, with the La Mama campaign, the most recent one after the building burnt down, but also the one 10 or 12 years ago when they first wanted to buy the building at La Mama Theatre in Melbourne. You approached the Potter Foundation and they said, what are the Myers doing? And you approached the Meyer Foundation, they said, what are the Potters doing? And so they understood that they were the lead donors and their giving would leverage others. Foundations also look for innovation. And in fact, a lot of donors look for innovation. And part of that thinking is because philanthropy doesn't want to do what any other source of funding could be doing. It doesn't want to make up for what government should be doing. It doesn't want to make up for what the corporate sector or earned income or box office or your own general revenue could actually be doing. It wants to do something that only philanthropy can do. And it's a good thing, but it does also mean that we can find ourselves jumping through hoops to create programs because that's where the funding sits. And so the importance, again, of thinking strategically about who you are and what you want to achieve, and therefore how you make the approach is important. But so generally, when you're talking to foundations, you're talking about the impact that their support would have, and the language around innovation and leverage can be helpful. Now, foundations and individuals, certainly over the last 20 years, have sort of blurred the distinction between them with the PAFs. You're doubtless familiar with the private ancillary funds that were introduced originally in 2002 as a kind of a foundation light. They're much less structured and they're much less onerous to administer. And so it has encouraged affluent and high net worth individuals to make that philanthropic transition and make a statement about what they're doing. But in terms of marketing or targeting the market, the way I think of it is that the foundations are larger, they're structured, there's a clear sort of criteria that they want to fulfill, there's a clear impact. And often enough, there is an administrator and a director, so someone who is sort of the gatekeeper. And often indeed, I'm obviously much more familiar with the Melbourne foundations, but you know, the Helen McPherson Smith, the R.E. Ross Trust, the original donors are long gone. So there's a structure and there's an administration that actually drives that. Whereas with the PAFs, there's an individual living, usually, still operating and quite active in this. And so you need to win the individual round. And it is actually one of the bank accounts that they could be making a donation to you from. And again, my best experience of this is Betty Amsden. I now chair her foundation, but when she was with us, she gave through her PAF and she gave directly. So she did them both. And as she was looking for the appropriate leverage or impact or whatever that she wanted to make. So with the PAFs, I would put them on the individual box when you're actually thinking about how do we generate a strategy for targeting PAFs. You need to win the individual round. You need to court the individual. So foundations, the corporate sector, when it comes to its interaction with the non-profit sector, and then perhaps particularly with the arts, they also are looking for innovation and leverage. But again, over the last 20 years, there's been such a blurring of the lines as to where sort of corporate sponsorship and corporate benefit and corporate social responsibility, community engagement and community involvement, and then philanthropy. There's all sorts of points along that spectrum that we could be targeting. I find that, in fact, I believe very strongly that the best way with the corporate sector, and even in some cases whether you're talking about corporate philanthropy from their foundation, they're basically, if there's no deal, there's no relationship. So it is much more transactional. Whereas with individual giving and foundation giving, if there's no relationship, there's no deal. So I think with the corporate sector, it's always really, the language is actually around what can we do for you rather than what can you do for us. All of that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. It really is just understanding where that fits in your strategy and your funding pie. So corporations are looking for innovation and leverage when they interact with the arts, but they're also looking for citizenship and raised profile, like corporate citizenship. They want to be seen to be good citizens these days. They also want to raise their profile among target groups. They also ultimately want business to business, or they want sales, because they are profit driven. And in as much as we can help them do that, then we should build it into our strategy. But it's higher cost of sales and it's higher cost of service. So we must be wary of boards in particular sitting there and going, have you thought about NAB, or why don't you approach Qantas? It's really, it's higher cost of sales and it's higher cost of service. So thinking about where that sits. So impact and influence are important elements in talking to and building relationships with individuals. But individual donors are the ones who dig deeper, stay with you longer, build their loyalty, and the relationship grows over time. So with corporate sector, you can go from 0 to 60 pretty quickly in terms of coming up with a proposition which they like, and they'll provide the support, but they can go from 60 to 0 just as fast as the global financial crisis proved 10 years ago, and over the last couple of years with COVID. Although, to be fair, they did do an awful lot. I think there was a lot more corporate giving last year, but that was largely to do with the bushfires and then COVID. And so steady state looks quite different. But so with individuals, it takes you a long time to get from 0 to 60, but then they keep going. And they don't stop. And in fact, if they have a relationship with you, they don't like to stop. They recognize that you're in crisis through COVID. They recognize, and they'll dig that bit deeper. So individuals are, I believe, the core of arts support ultimately. And if you're talking to wanting to build a relationship with the individuals who are on your radar, then everything you talk about to do with philanthropy has to be about impact, how the world is going to look better as a result of the support that they've given you. They also are interested in innovation. They're also interested in leverage. Betty, my mentor, Betty, one of the big things that she did with the Arts Centre Melbourne was to innovate with them, co-curate in many respects, the Betty Amson Participation Programme. And back sort of now 10 years ago, that sort of approach to the community on the stage was relatively new to the Arts Centre, perhaps not to the arts, but certainly to the Arts Centre, to an institution like the Arts Centre. And it was revolutionary for the Arts Centre in its way, but it innovated, and it would only have happened with her philanthropy. And so looking for ways that actually would generate the kind of social impact, the community impact, and the arts and cultural impact was really important to Betty as she was thinking through those things. So innovation is important, but also following through that case study of Betty, she made that pledge and she started that program in 2012, 2013. By that stage, she'd been giving for 15 years. So the journey that she'd taken led to the $5 million pledge. It didn't happen in 1994 when she started giving. It didn't happen in 2000 when she was still relatively new. She was still building that relationship with the Arts Centre. So it took time to generate that sort of relationship. So take the time and think through who really cares. So donors like to support impact. The world, that language, if you tattoo it on your arm, if you haven't got it tattooed already, that's such an important word in philanthropy. Donors are also looking for influence. They're looking for influence for themselves in some cases, influence for others in other cases. So, you know, citizenship, being seen to be the right community leader. There is a sense of we're successful, so we should give back. There is also a sense of this is a reflection of how successful we are. So that sense of citizenship is important to actually how do you reflect and manage your relationship with your donors. And yes, they can be looking to raise profile, their own profile, for whatever reason. And again, absolutely no problem with that, as long as it actually generates more support, which it does. The more people peer over the fence and see somebody who looks like me giving, then I'm more likely to give. So I think the raise profile is really important. And then finally, for individuals, that word involvement. And that, again, the Betty story is that she started as a member, then she became a donor, a low level, then she increased her giving over time. The more involved she became. And ultimately, she felt that the Arts Centre was part of her family and she was part of ours. So involvement and belonging really leads to a depth of support that we can't begin to imagine when we're actually starting out on our giving journey. So thinking through what do each of these, who's on our radar and what do they want to achieve and how can we help them achieve it is probably the first thing really in planning. There you go. There you go. So I'm going to focus on individuals from here on in, but you can extrapolate all of many of the messages to all sorts of different areas. So I've talked a little bit about motivations in general as a sectoral thing. For an individual donor, and I would argue, I mean, $2 is tax deductible, and any child who sits with a dollar coin and thinks, do I put this in the box for the homeless, or do I put this in the box with the Labrador, is actually making a philanthropic decision. What do you want to achieve from your giving? That's the difference between philanthropy and charity, I think. Charity is important. It is a lead into a philanthropic, a lifetime philanthropic commitment. But what donors really start off thinking is, do I care? Do I care about the cause? And they give according to how much they care, not according to how much money they have. And I think that's a really important thing. Again, working with a number of clients, but I could name 3 or 4 clients over a number of years now where, you know, we've talked to, they want to do a capital campaign or some kind of campaign. And we say, be great if, you know, the board could lead the way, or if you do some of this. And then they're always going, but see him over there, he could just write the check, a single check. Well, yeah, but does he care? There was one Queensland organisation 10 or 12 years ago who said, you know, yeah, but Clive Palmer could write a single check. I said, yes, but has Clive Palmer ever crossed your threshold? Has he ever, you know, cared about the arts? Do you know him? Does any of his family care about the arts? So do I care about the cause is the first thing. And sure, we're looking for capacity to give, but actually inclination to give raises more money. So when a donor is considering us, they're thinking, do I care? And then if I care about the cause, which might be arts, it might be community, it might be arts for social good, it might be commissioning, it could be absolutely anything. But if I care about that, is this organisation actually going to turn the dial? So do I have a compelling belief that this organisation is actually operating exactly at the place that I believe the impact is going to be made? So yes, if yes, then they start to think, well, is the organization well run? If I'm thinking of giving it my money, how well do they run it? Does it run at a surplus? Has it run, consistently at a loss? They're thinking a little bit more carefully about, sure, brand, but also a little bit more carefully about the operation of what's the perception of how well it is run as a business. Then they peer over the fence and go, who's involved that I know and or respect? And I've heard of so many tales of donors and board members and volunteers and ambassadors and staff, in fact, who were never particularly interested in a cause, but were invited to do something by somebody they respected, and it became a lifelong commitment. And so I think it's really important, again, as I said before, we all do things that people like us do. So peering over the fence and saying who's involved, and well, if they're involved, it must be a good organization. It's a reinforcement of confidence in the organization, which is why it's important how we use our volunteers and board members and ambassadors. So having gone through all of those things, they then start to think, okay, well, what precisely do they want money for? What do they actually wanted to fundraise for? Is it commissions? Is it a building? Is it general revenue? What do they want money for? And then in the context of that, what difference will my gift make? So if you want $100,000 for a project or a program, and I give you $5,000, they can understand that 5,000 is the brick that will contribute towards the $100,000 cathedral. Whereas if you're saying we need $1 million capital campaign, and I can only afford $5,000, and you haven't raised any of the other 995,995, then my 5,000 just feels like a drop in the ocean. So that context of the scale and the scope of what their contribution is going to be important as well. Now, I stress all of those because if you think about, do I care about the cause? Is this organization going to turn the dial? Is it well run? And who's involved? Have nothing to do with fundraising. They are actually organizational issues. And so if we don't have donors who care about the cause, if we haven't got an organization that is appropriately positioned to make people realize when they walk past it that philanthropy can make a difference, they're not going to know that this organization can turn the dial. If we've had a few years of a few bad cycles, financial cycles, if there's a high churn at the leadership level, if whatever, all of this is sort of what reinforces or scares donors to get too involved. And if we really don't use our networks, and I'm not necessarily, when we say who's involved that I know and or respect, I'm not talking necessarily high profile. It really is the peer group. So if we haven't got a peer group that is willing to reach out to its peer group, it doesn't matter how good the fundraiser is. So that's why when we really start to look at planning, we actually start by looking at the organization. And there are a number of factors. We call them critical success factors. We've distilled them down to 5. You could have sub lists of all sorts of this, but we've distilled them down to 5 just to try and make them a little bit more bite-sized. They're not unique to us, and in fact, they are critical success factors. Every fundraiser knows them, but putting them in this way in the planning process can actually help the non-fundraisers around us to understand the context in which we need everybody to operate. So the first one is vision. A critical success factor for successful and sustainable fundraising is actually that the organization has a vision and a case for support for a vision for where it's going, and a case for support for why philanthropy is going to be able to get it there. Case for support isn't a shopping list. It isn't a tick box. A case for support that keeps the lights on and flushes the toilets isn't a case for support. It's simply budgeting. So there really needs to be a proposition for where philanthropy sits in the scheme of things, and what difference it can do. Going back to that point earlier, that donors don't like to do things that other sources of funding should be doing. So think through that. Major giving is about additionality. It's about doing something that leverages other things to happen in the organization that other money wouldn't be able to do. So when you're thinking about your vision and your case for philanthropy, obviously there's untied funds to do what we'd like to do is really important, but what will really unlock major giving is actually to do things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The second factor is internal leadership, the executive leadership. And we say here, internal leaders who play an integral role in setting the fundraising ambitions and actually help to nurture donors. So the executive director, the leadership team, however large or small your organization is, that executive leadership actually sets the behaviors for the rest of the organization, sets the value base on which we operate. And so it's really important that if fundraising is an important part of the current revenue, let alone the future revenue of the organization, that the executive leadership understands how making this work is going to mean understands what it's going to mean for everybody else in the organization, changing whatever their daily lives might look like. Through creative partnerships recently, we've been we're doing another piece of training work with creative partnerships, and part of that is to do some interviews for case studies. And so I was talking to Kenneth Watkins and Libby Christie from the Australian Ballet, and listening to Libby talking about what the culture of philanthropy looks like. And this is the executive director describing beautifully how marketing and fundraising work together, how marketing and philanthropy sit down together and work out what the messages are going to be. Well, I can remember 10, 12 years ago when Valerie Wilder was executive director there, and Kenneth, they were trying to build the team and build the focus for their 50th. Then, marketing was always really concerned that any talk of philanthropy or giving might cannibalize ticket sales. And of course, that is a frequent sort of concern. But unless the executive leadership sort of makes that happen and makes those two groups work together, for example, then again, it kind of leaves fundraising out in the cold. So the whole organization, there are implications for how we market, for how we run our finances, for what the production team or what the programming team might be doing. The executive leadership needs to understand that and encourage them to all work together. Third factor is external leadership, board members and ambassadors. This is the network out to our wider constituency. And that's the who's involved that I know and or respect. And we need ambassadors, and they could be our current donors, they could be our ticket buyers, they could be our family. They could be anyone who's willing to get out there and say, this is so good what this organization is doing. I love it, and I think you'll love it too. They bring them in. So I think the role of external leadership, and we'll doubtless come to this at some stage, as to when or whether boards should give and so on and so forth. The role of boards and even fundraising committees, I think, is to make people care, not to make people give, because people will give when they care. So I think the role of the external leadership is to be able to spread the word and spread the love about how this organization is doing such wonderful things, and you will love it if you come in and spend time with them. But there's a practical and quite proactive role we need them to play in that. Then we move into the fundraising world itself. Who are the prospects that we actually have, and what programs of contact and cultivation should we design to build the relationships with them? So your fundraising program needs to create a journey for donors from pipeline when they're sort of nascent, just walking past, or bought their first ticket, or come into the gallery for the first time, or whatever they're doing, through to major giving. And the more structured we can make that program, it needs to be authentic, it needs to be heartfelt, but it's also, there's a discipline to it. So it needs to be a structured program of contact and cultivation. Otherwise you can have wasted energy in our interactions with many of the people who really do care about us. And that then defines what skills and resources we're going to need to run the program. And so you need a dedicated fundraising resource. And often, I know for small organizations, the question is, well, we can't afford a fundraiser. That's okay. You still need a dedicated resource, whatever resource you have, even if you're volunteer-led. And if nobody's actually a paid staffer at all, who is going to put 20, 30, 40, 60% of their time, 100% of their time to actually making sure that the donor community, the prospecting donor community that we have gets the relationship with us that will actually, make music. So you need some kind of dedicated resource, you need some kind of database, you need an Excel spreadsheet, and you need to be disciplined about how you capture and manage information. So if you think about it, those 5 factors are the ways that you actually answer those donor questions. Do I care? Who's involved? How well is it run? Managing this and finding answers to this is effectively your case for support. Another way of thinking about the donor journey, and everything in fundraising is either a pyramid or a funnel, as far as I'm concerned. So you go from the broad end to the pointy end. And I'll come to the donor pyramid, the fundraising pyramid next. But actually, in terms of looking at how an organization, the organizational framework, and who does what in fundraising and building the relationships, this funnel I've found to be a helpful way of understanding or thinking through where the constituencies lie, and therefore what the appropriate strategy should be to draw them in. So we work with an organization and we say, who is your broader radar? Who's actually on your radar? Who's your universe? And you can pick out a slice of that and go from the outer rings of the universe into the center, and that's really what this funnel is. So many of your constituency, many of your, audience, ticket buyers, whatever the nature of your organization, most of the people who interact with you will be sitting at the outer end of this funnel. They know about you, and they're aware of who you are and what you're doing, but they don't necessarily realize that you're in the business of raising funds, that you're in the business of raising philanthropy and spending it wisely. And they're not necessarily also in the business of understanding that whatever it is that they consume of your organization is at the benefit of somebody else's philanthropy. So I think for the people that sit out there, the strategy is to communicate. And it's not fundraising per se, and it's not necessarily certainly not your relationship fundraising. Direct mail appeals and your crowdfunding could actually sit out here in the communicate piece, because this is about getting people to give for the first time. But the strategy is really to communicate, to raise awareness of your organization, its vision, its mission, and its case for support. So that's where, actually, I'll come back to that. So that the communicate is an important piece for drawing people in, letting them know that you're in the business of raising funds and spending them wisely. For a constituency that sits in the middle, so they know enough about you, they've interacted with you, they might even be donors, then how do you actually, this is where you start to build the relationship with them. You build a sense of belonging and ownership, start talking about the future, start drawing them into the inner sanctum. People love to feel they're behind the scenes. People love to feel that they're actually getting some experience. And also in the cultural world, I think so many donors, myself included, this is why I'm not particularly creative, but it's why I love working in the arts, is that there is that point of creation, that point of creativity. It's like looking at nuclear fission. I remember I used to be on the board of the malt house, and we we were saying, let us get donors into the rehearsal room for all of the complicating factors it might be. What donors really want to see or think they want to see is they want to be able to spot that point at which creation happens, creativity happens, and it's business as usual for those of us who are, even those of us who are artists. But it's such magic for people who are further away and they have dull day jobs like fundraising consultants, and so it's great if they can actually engage, and so it's worth the while for the organization to start building a personal sort of interaction with people at this stage. Then the third point is that those of your donors or constituency who are really at the heart of who you are and what you do, they know you well. The fact that you know them well. If you haven't asked for money already, why not? And if they're already giving, you can ask them for more. But actually, invite commitment. That's really at the point where if they've gone through the journey, they've bought the first ticket, they've multi-tickets, they've been a subscriber, they've joined as a member, they've actually become a low-level donor, then they'll really get committed. Now that's the journey that Betty Anderson took for the Arts Centre. So there's different ways of thinking about this funnel, but if you're an executive, a board or an executive, I think this is the way to see things from the helicopter and say, begin to understand why. You might well have, a bunch of billionaires buying tickets at the communicate level, but they're not going to give you the millions until they get to the commit level. So it's a way of sort of understanding where people sit well, actually, frankly, where we sit in relation to them rather than where they sit in relation to us, and therefore the appropriate type of interaction to have with them. And in some respects, the fundraising, as I say, fundraising starts here, and the fundraising pyramid, I think, starts here. Yes, it can start further up here, but we do obviously a lot of work with universities still, and many universities, and most of the group of 8 universities here have just about completed their first mega campaigns. And we're looking at the results of 10 or 15 years of effort. But my premise is that they've actually raised significant amount of money from the people who are closest to them, and they're running out of pipeline. They need to build more relationships. And one of the reasons they're running out of pipeline is that the development office has been, wonderfully run campaigns, but the university's approach is that the development office is running that campaign. It's nothing to do with us. It's not our campaign, it's theirs. And that's why, there's actually a lead wall in some cases between the invite commitment and the engage level people. Unless the university itself is looking after people and building the relationships, what they need to be doing is where does alumni relations sit? Where do sort of clinician scientists, academics sit with in relation to the people that they treat, the people that they know, the causes that they work in? How can we build those relationships and feed them into a closer relationship with the development office? Then the development office is really left to kind of create brand new relationships, and it becomes fundraising belongs to the fundraiser rather than the organization. So I think that the fundraising pyramid actually starts at this commitment level. So the fundraising program, depending on where your constituencies sit, who you know, how many you have, who they are, where they sit, you've got to scan your own universe in this respect, and then sort of make up your mind which of these programs most applies to you. It's interesting that in fact, still, I think in Australia, after sort of 25 or 30 years of good fundraising, there's often there's a handful of people at the top making major gifts, and then there's a lot of people at the bottom making low-level gifts and nothing in the middle. There's just a vacuum in that middle level, and it's organisations that have consistently applied serious best practice, like the Australian Ballet, that have actually populated the middle of the pyramid. They start with appeals campaigns, but they draw you in. They have a stewardship program that then encourages you to become a repeat donor, which is through their patrons program. They get to know their patrons really well. They understand what the patrons want to achieve for the ballet or through the ballet. And so they'll have a major giving conversation with them. They're not afraid to have a major giving conversation with them about how do we work with you to make the ballet stronger. And that feeds into a planned giving, a really strong sort of bequest program, which builds their endowment. So I know from many years' experience that small organisations that are struggling, for day-to-day resource, you can peer over the fence and you look at the Australian Ballet and you go, well, they can do it, we can't. And sure, the ballet has thrown resources at this, but they've actually thrown that culture of commitment to it as well. And also, what you're seeing today is 25 years of consistent application of a solid program, which is why they've populated the middle. And I think what's happened with a lot of organizations is, for all sorts of reasons, good and bad, they get the big gift, they work at the little gift, and they haven't got the energy or resources to be consistent about what they're doing. And I forget which US president or general actually said it, but persistence is really what wins the day, not necessarily the magic of Harry Potter with his wand. So that's a good solid time around why you plan and what the background to planning is. And I believe it's important, and having worked now with, golly, we added up recently, we've worked with about 170 organizations over the last sort of 15, 16 years, and 70 or 80 of those are arts organizations. So there's some fabulous work going on, but I'm stressing the background to thinking as to not how you plan, but actually what should go into the planning exercise. That's really very important to me and to all of us at Philanthropy Squared. And the approach that we try to bring in working with organizations is to say, don't just treat fundraising in isolation. There's a whole other ecology that actually makes fundraising work that you need to think about when you're putting your plan together. So, steps to creating your fundraising plan. For those of you who are looking for the sort of the action, what can we do now? Hopefully, this is moving into that sort of more practical phase for you. The first thing to consider is obviously, where are we now? What's the current situation? What's your starting point? And I would encourage you actually to, if you're approaching a fundraising planning exercise, and universities work on academic calendar years, so this is a good time for them to be planning. But if you're tipping over into January, February, March, that is the time to start thinking about what financial year 22-23 is going to look like. And it's a good time to actually draw others around you in the organization into thinking through with you, what should your fundraising plan look like? And so we would encourage you to think about having pulling together a small working group that might involve a board member, the executive director, and or another executive if you're a large enough organization, and the fundraiser. And so actually a working group, which is project managed by the fundraiser, if you like, to sit down and ask all of these questions of yourselves. The group that you can bounce ideas off, you can brainstorm. And it also is a group that you can ask the dumb questions, and in a safe space, if you like, and you can really start working out this together. So it becomes the organization's fundraising plan, not the fundraiser's fundraising plan. So you've got your small working group, you're sitting down, and the first thing you say, oh, where are we now? Questions to ask yourself is, what does your current fundraising program comprise? Individual giving, different levels of patronage. Do you have an annual giving program? Do you do a couple of appeals? What does it look like? Do you go for trusts and foundations? Have you had any major gifts? What does it actually look like? We would say, what are the 3-year trends overall? So if you've had 3 years of fundraising activity, it's a good time to sort of sit down and go, okay, what are the trends? So overall and program by program. So you're looking at what's your total income that you've generated from fundraising. And maybe ask yourself, what's the total income as a percentage of total income for the organization? Yep. So what's your total income from fundraising and program by program? So we raised 75,000 last year. 40 of that was from trusts and foundations. 15 of that was from the appeal, whatever. So year by year. What are your donor numbers? How many donors do you have? Too often, frankly, boards, they don't see the numbers about donor numbers. They just look at the bottom line and they see the financials. But donor numbers is crucial. So are you raising 100,000 from 100 people, or are you raising 100,000 from 3 people? And 100,000 from 3 people is fantastic, but it's terribly precarious for the organization. So maybe the strategy therefore is telling you need to broaden your donor base. So you actually, diversifying your income a little bit more. And if 3 people get knocked down by a bus, you've still got some money coming in. So donor numbers. What's the average gift? What's the largest gift? And, all of that can be quite telling if the average gift is $60 or if the average gift is 600 or 700. The Art Centre has been tapping into our own database, our broad database of ticket buyers. So this is not the database of the resident companies, but this is people who come to Art Centre productions. And so it's about 300,000 people. About 300,000 people that we've approached in campaigns and appeals over the last 2 or 3 years. And 4 or 5 years ago, the Art Centre had sort of 200 donors, and now we've got 6,500. So 4.5 years ago, the Art Centre was generating comfortable income from people giving a larger amount, but they're an aging cohort. They've been with us for a long time. They're looking for renewal themselves, and there was no pipeline. So looking at the average gift 4 years ago, the average gift might have been $10,000, and now the average gift is, actually, I think that it was about 1,500. I think if you really pull them all in. So the average gift has lowered, but the number of donors has increased, and that's the future pipeline. And another thing to ask yourself is, who are your top 10? That's often a really good way, because we'd like our board members and everybody to know who our top 10 donors are, because then they will get sort of, they need a bit of love. So the third thing that this little working group can look at is actually, what are the organizational issues that impact on fundraising, for good or for ill? So what's the case of support? What's the balance of core funds versus project opportunities that we can actually generate and think about and talk about? What's the quality of our data and the quantity of our data? And is most of our data, because you find with in the performing arts, for example, obviously the ticket databases, you've got a marketing database where we have sort of lots of information that's actually quite shallow, because we're sort of, it's a push exercise. Then with fundraising, we need quality information, so we actually need to know much more about people. And so most databases are geared up for the breadth and not the depth. So is that going to be an issue? What do we do about it? Where does that sit? Then what is the leadership doing? This of course is referring back to the critical success factors. Is the leadership support there? Does the board really, is it willing to do what it takes? Is it able to do what it takes? Is the CEO willing to do what it takes? Is he or she able to do what it takes? And what about the non-fundraising executives? So this is sort of testing the temperature of the culture of the organization. And then what skills and resources do we have for the fundraising process? And there are organizations where they've stretched really hard to try and find a decent enough salary for a fundraiser, but then there's no budget for the fundraiser to do anything with. And so, you can hire a good fundraiser, but if you haven't got a decent database, they can spend a lot of time faffing around actually trying to get data. So you're paying your most expensive resource to faff around in data. It can be it's a false economy not to invest in a database, but to expect, a staff resource to do that. So looking at skills and resources, what about the communications? Does the fundraising have the budget it needs to be able to do what we want them to achieve? So that's your SWOT, really. That's the current situation. Drawing some conclusions at this stage. We're strong on this, we're weak on that, we need to work on that. So let's look at the future. So then the next thing is, where are we going? What are your priorities for this fundraising plan? And I would also recommend that you look, if you're doing this for the first time, give yourselves a 3-year time horizon. You look back 3 years, you look ahead 3 years. Your operational year on year should be in response to things that the way you want the world to look like in 3 years' time, and not just the bottom line that we need to hit by June 30 next year. So where are we going? What are your priorities for this plan? So it could be, well, obviously, we might need to increase dollars. We might need to diversify income sources, like the Arts Centre decided it needed to do. Or it might diversify income sources from something else and into fundraising, so that you're less reliant on government support or a box office or corporate sponsorship, for example. It might be that we need to increase donor numbers. We need to improve repeat giving rates. We need a major gifts campaign to achieve. It could be, what's your future case for support as well. I mean, these are actually sort of more granular, but they could be bigger gifts. Where's bigger considerations? Where's the organisation going, and how can fundraising help? Then you're looking at what strategies and tactics will we apply to get there, and thinking through what are the key activities you'll need to do to achieve these goals, to achieve whatever your where are we going goals you've outlined. And I say pick out 3 to 5 headline actions with some detail worked out. And so again, this is looking at the breadth of the whole program, and not just we're going to do a direct mail piece 3 times a year or something. That's part of it, but it is only part of it. So say 3 to 5 headline actions with some detail worked out. So the headline action could be, we need to grow through donor engagement and retention. And then under that, you'd have, we will build a stewardship matrix. We will, get the board involved in telephoning to say thank you. We will, so sub things behind that. It could be improve awareness and understanding of the need for funds amongst our broader audience. And so, again, going back to the Australian Ballet and the time around their 50th anniversary, the Valerie Wilder put in the season brochure, like the launch of the season for the year, she put on page 2, I think, a fundraising message. The message was, it was a pie with a slice taken out of it that said, the pie is the total cost of your seat, and this is the price you pay for tickets. So it demonstrated quite clearly and very visually and right up front in the season brochure that somebody else's philanthropy is enabling you to buy a ticket at only whatever it was, let alone what it might be today. But that's sort of the thinking behind improve awareness and understanding of the need for funds among our broader audience. So that's a wider comms piece. That's at the broad end of the funnel. It could be improved systems. So what do we need to do? We need to, make sure that, maybe we need to buy a CRM. Maybe we need to add some fundraising modules to the CRM that we've got. It could be, we actually just need to be a bit more disciplined with an Excel spreadsheet so that we do some follow-up. It could be we need some policies around what money we're going to accept, what we're not, what's a gift acceptance policy. Actually, that acceptance policy would sit more comfortably under the next one, which would be tighter organizational framework to support fundraising. And under here, you would have, this is the roles of the board, this is what we need some ambassador programs, if we need a fundraising committee. So this is where the roles and responsibilities would sit, and therefore what kind of training or professional development or support this organizational framework. It could also mean internal communications sits under organizational frameworks, sort of the drip feed of messaging about the importance of philanthropy and celebrating philanthropy when it comes in, comes from the top. So that's the organizational framework. Then, having done all of that thinking, it's like, what do we need to achieve this? What actually underpins this? What are we going to do? But what do we need in order to do what we need to do? So we need networks. We need greater board involvement to tap into these networks. We might need donor engagement. So this informs the roles of management and board and other departments. It might mean communications. It might mean more active support from marketing. It could mean data. We will address CRM, IT support. It could be dedicated resources, new staff, more staff, staff to do administrative staff to do more, data input, making sure that we can actually really drive some of these processes and free up the fundraiser to do the fundraising. So that's sort of the elements that feed under the strategy and tactics we will apply. And then finally, obviously last but by no means least, it is what targets and metrics and budgets do you need? This is the granularity of it all, specific financial targets and key metrics as well. And I say non-financial are as important as the financial. So if you decide that you really need to diversify your fundraising base, but you need to raise X, then raising X is there. But if we need more donors, then that should be a specific target as well, non-financial. So what I've got just for the last couple of slides before we move on to questions is, here's an example, if you like, of this kind of strategy and tactics and how, you might write it down, just put it as a table. Strategy 1, growth through donor engagement and retention. So the initiative would be improve donor stewardship. Actions is ensure thank yous and receipts. Introduce thank you calls for different levels of giving. Initiative 2 would be inform and educate donors and prospects regarding the impact of gifts. Do we have an impact report? A quarterly donor e-news with profiles and stories. Improve evaluation process to finish the sentence might be helpful there as well. So all that kind of thinking sits under there, but that's that word impact again. We want to build relationships between donors and key program areas. This was something that we had, this was adapted from an Art Centre one, actually even before 2015, a long time ago. Shows how old I am now. But so, we had this idea, build relationships between donors and key program areas. So a buddy system. So when donors were interested in, they might have given us 10,000. And back in the Richard Pratt days when he was chair, people gave 10,000 and they sort of joined this club, but they didn't really know where the money was going. So we never asked them whether they cared about education versus access versus commissions versus whatever. But when we did, we could then buddy them up with the department and the staff involved in that area, and they really built a depth of information. And many of those people then, in 94, 95, 96, are still giving now and still giving more because they've actually got to know specific people in the organization and the work that they're doing. So it's so important. And then, last thing is inform and educate donors and prospects. So that's a comms piece. So that's a way of showing this that the activities under each of your strategies that you should apply. And then there's a projections worksheet. And I remember working with James Boyd, actually, Creative Partnerships in WA, when he was at WASO, going back a long time, but I remember us doing this kind of exercise, and we were mapping and preparing trying to do some projections as to how many patrons you'd need to generate this amount of money, and then what would need. And I've still got them. We've got about 5 or 6 different spreadsheets that we batted backwards and forwards until we got to the point where we were confident of the projections, the numbers that we'd estimated, and the projections we were making. So a spreadsheet like this, I think depending on the size and scale of your organization, it needn't be onerous, but if you really want to be quite particular and it's a sizable organization, there'll be spreadsheets behind something like this But here again, you can see the targets overall and the targets for each different program piece, from direct mail through a patrons program, through your major gifts, trust and foundations, and bequests. And you can see the change year on year, and there might be, you'd have a column on the right hand side that might phrase the assumptions that you've made, that says why you think it's going to drop 16% in this year, but then grow. And also the total number of active donors is there as a target in and of itself. So this as a snapshot is a good way of presenting to executive leadership and ultimately the board, so that they can see at a glance what the fundraising program looks like and what each of the pieces is expected to deliver. And you will find that major gifts and trust and foundations will generate 80% of the revenue. The board needs to understand that. So making that visual is important. So all of that, of course, generates the word that boards love, which is what's your return on investment. And the ROI is important. It's important to enroll your boards and enroll your executives and have them understand the whole process and understand the business that goes into raising the money. But I've added the P there because donors are also looking for a return on their philanthropic impact. So the ROPI is actually very important to donors, and that fits the impact piece as well. And that point, I think I will call Christina back in, and I'm absolutely open to any questions you might throw at me.
Thank you so much, Frankie. I can listen to that all day. I think there's so many important concepts that we might just recall through other avenues, but the way you presented it and reminded us of the importance of its context within fundraising has been such a great reminder. Thank you so much. You have kicked off a few questions, particularly around systems and resources for smaller organisations or for those starting out. I think we all recognise how effective and successful the ballet is. And knowing that it's taken them 25 years is a good reminder that they started somewhere. They started small and they started with less. Starting off with a bunch of questions around CRMs. This might not be something you can answer specifically. Others in the room might be able to as well. So feel free if others have ideas in the chat. But for small organisations, databases are expensive. And you mentioned Excel. Do you know anything in between that the system that's out in the marketplace is emerging, already exists, that you've seen work for small to medium organisations that have maybe 1,000 members on their database, that might be something people could look at investing in?
Personally, no. I think Salesforce is becoming ubiquitous for large and small. In the fundraising world, the big ones have been Razor's Edge, and obviously Tessitura in the performing arts. They are big and they're expensive and they're Rolls Royces, and for small and even medium organisations, they're not necessary, I don't think. So I have seen. Razor's Edge has an online version. I forget what it's called, but doubtless somebody on the call today will know, or I can find out and let you know. It's in the cloud, and so it's actually much cheaper and easier to manage. But Salesforce also is a good, solid basic. I think there's a lot of organisations, small organisations, I know, that have used some form of Salesforce, and it's nowhere near as comprehensive as the big organisations. There will be a couple in between. I'm happy to research it and come back to you. But we have also simply seen that Excel is a phenomenal program. It do a lot of things. So it's really just thinking through upfront what it is you want to record and making sure you record it systematically, because then Excel can feed you back and do all the analysis you might want it to do once you get to a certain point. And certainly in the fundraising world, if you're talking, as soon as you're talking about major gifts, or who are you talking to, a patrons program, if you like, doesn't even be about major gifts, but a patrons program where if you're a small organization, you're not likely to have thousands, you might not even have hundreds, then Excel is really good enough.
And one of the questions that came from Claire Edwards. Hi, Claire. She says, I use Airtable, but it doesn't have that automated function. So it's missing that piece that supports your engagement. A couple of people, if you don't mind, I'm just going through the chat. Someone's mentioned that eTapestry is
that's it. Yes. Yeah.
And that the Raiser's Edge program is called NXT.
NXT. Yep.
And I've also seen organisations explore the idea of consortiums outside of Tessitura. So, we don't have a great habit, I think, in the arts of collaborating across fundraising. We're all quite protective of our data and our people. But there's perhaps an argument to be said for exploring investment in systems across like-minded organisations. It might not be sharing data, but it's sharing investment in systems. And I know Salesforce was an option for consortiums as well with some organisations. So those of you on the call today, I encourage you to look at who else is here, who's asking about CRMs, and talk to each other. The more we can share costs, and that's how Tessitura came to be, was through others investing in it.
Yes.
Certainly an option as well. There's another one called Raisely. It's a free CRM for charities. So go through the chat, people. I think there's some other ones being mentioned. Another question that sort of relates to that is around access to audience data. So this question came from a small theatre company that are looking to kick off their fundraising plans. And one of their constant barriers is getting access to ticket buyers when they're not the presenter. They engage a festival or a venue. And they are the ones who control and keep the ticketing buyers' emails.
Yeah.
Have you, Frankie, ever found a way around this so that the theatre company can come out of their performances at a festival or venue with data?
There is no easy way, and unless over time we can actually start to build that into contracts, I think, as to who owns the data. That's the best way to do it, is to start working a way that you can actually build it into your contract as to, the access to the data that you're generating. There's no real substitute for that in the long run. In the short run, if you haven't got that access, then it's a not dissimilar problem to in a museum or a gallery where entry is free and people don't really know. So you get around that by some organizations get around it by sort of creating a friends program and promoting that and getting people to sign up as that. So you get the sign up and then you get the direct engagement. You could have a competition which could be sponsored. Win a bottle of wine or a bottle of cake. Bottle probably wouldn't be much of an incentive. Might be to some, but a case of wine or whatever. If you give us your details, actually promote that in your program or whatever that might be. So you're actually trying to get people to give you their information, so they're giving it direct to you and not to the venue. But it is a bit more. It is onerous. But so like come back to, there's no substitute for actually working to try and find some middle ground where you can access the data of the people who are actually buying your ticket.
I agree. There needs to be sort of a bigger conversation around those agreements. But another person on the chat just said flyers on seats. So really, there's in-venue opportunities where you've got a captive audience. It might take sourcing on the part of the theatre company, but if you can be there with an iPad, with the questionnaire, with the survey, with the competition, produce a good-looking but relatively economic flyer about incentivizing your data sharing with the audience, I think is great. There's another question around resourcing. So terrific. Everyone's saying terrific presentation, by the way, Frankie. If you don't have the resources like a large organisation, can you elaborate a bit more on how you would put the same discipline to work with less staff, even if volunteers are utilised? Is it about going slower, or is it about setting clear and realistic goals? Also, how do you judge when to introduce requests into the culture of asking?
Okay, two separate questions there, or I'll treat them separately. So for small organisations, some kind of dedicated resource. In fact, I think Sheena Baugen is in on this call today, but I first met Sheena when she was chair at Four Winds Festival 10, 11, 12 years ago. And that then was a biennial festival, so every 2 years. And there was a real vision for where it wanted to, where the festival was going, or for where the organisation could go, to have a year round. But they also wanted a sound shell. So we started to talk about, how do we raise money for a sound shell? How do we go from naught to $1 million for an organisation that didn't, was volunteer led. And Sheena led it. And she brought everybody along with her. She brought the board with her. She brought me in to talk to the board, and everybody was given a job. And in relationship building or in direct fundraising, and so she led it. So she was the dedicated resource, or actually she turned everybody into a piece of the dedicated resource. And the 100% of resources dedicated to fundraising was a combination of her, the rest of the board, and the artistic director of the festival at the time was Genevieve Lacey. And so, it was a team effort because it was a group effort. And basically nobody was a paid fundraiser. So that's, if you like, textbook in a way of how do you look at resources you've got and say, which of those could we actually allocate that would make this fundraising work the way we want it to work. Then you can start saying, how fast or slow can we go? And again, depending on your constituency, on who you know and how much you know about your audience, how rapidly can you go into major giving? Because some kind of appeal, a capital campaign such that Four Winds ran for the sound shell was a good way of showing cause and effect of giving for people who've never been asked for money before. So think through what your case for support is as well, and therefore, frankly, of those who are close to us, how much can we ask them for is a determinant of how fast or slow you might be able to go. And then the last question about bequests. It's never too soon to start thinking about bequests, except you must think that bequests are seriously about immortality. Bequests are what people who want to keep happening after they're no longer with us. So they go to organizations that people believe will outlive them. And so, if you're just starting out as an organization, you haven't got the longevity, you haven't got the track record, then maybe bequest is not the right time, unless they are, again, part of family, so that the bequest will actually, secure. But there is a time and a place to think about that. And also it's the little guy that leaves a bequest. You go back to that pyramid, it's the little guy at the bottom. Sorry, I should have stopped sharing. I said I was going to. It's the little guy at the bottom who leaves you the bequest, because the major donor is more likely to set up their own path or their own giving vehicle. So your bequester is your loyal supporter who can't afford the major gift while they're with you.
Exactly. It doesn't, it's not to ignore those without the capacity now. We don't have the care and intention later. I just want to go back, Frankie, to the first question around resourcing. Something that stood out for me was you said that Sheena set goals for everyone. It was a clear tactic that led to some success, because not only was it about who is the resource, but what are they responsible for? And then I imagine it's those processes to check back in and ensure those goals are being met.
It's the basic discipline of being able to identify, the discipline of being able to contact your prospect base, to cultivate your prospect base, and then to make sure that you have an appropriate system that records receipts and says thank you. And it's discipline. It doesn't need a paid resource, and or in fact, because we come to a lot of organizations and there's more good fundraising jobs than there are good fundraisers. There's a need for many more people to come into fundraising. And if we can't find someone, then if the CEO becomes the CFO, the Chief Fundraising Officer, then you can actually, the resource you need to pay for might be an admin to make sure that the discipline happens. And in some respects, the discipline is more important than the paid fundraiser.
It shows you when the number of organisations who implement a database doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because the database isn't the solution.
Yes.
You're using it as the discipline and the processes the organisation has to manage that data. The CRM might be, unless we use it well enough, it won't actually deliver the results that we think the investment should.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another question, thanks Frankie, is around projections and advice on making projections and forecasts, I think they mean. Do you base these on the past 3-year trends or benchmarks for growth or other factors? Sometimes they're finding it difficult to balance ambition with reality.
This forecasting is a judgment. It's a judgment, it's not a science. And so you do look at the past and you do look at the market. But you also need to make a judgment of what is, you do need to benchmark, obviously, but you need to make a judgment as to where you're at. And again, I'm sure many of us that I've certainly sat on in meetings and boards that I'm reporting to as a consultant and boards that I've sat on, and somebody said, oh, Melbourne Uni's just raised $1 billion, so why don't we? And yeah, what part of this don't you get? So you can look at benchmarks, but you can look at the wrong benchmarks. So there's a judgment in this, and really understanding where you're at, and that's why I think if you're looking at that funnel, where do your constituencies lie? Because if you've got people who are in what you might characterize as in the engagement piece, look at they have some inclination, but what's their capacity? You've maybe never checked. And so, yeah, that's the whole exercise, that early exercise of saying, where are we now? And looking at their engagement piece and where do our constituencies sit? And we may have never talked to them about fundraising before. Well, that's an opportunity. It's not a threat. So, we're working with a couple of organizations at the moment that are sort of medium size, and they came to us and want to start out. And the initial expectation was that, there's major donors out there who give to the arts, but we don't know if they've ever been to us. And we've said, look at your database. Who comes now? People give according to how much they care. So that's part of the judgment.
Absolutely. And it takes an investigation now into all that data you hopefully have on your constituents. Who are they, and so on.
I've just seen Diane Fletcher's response. Sun Tzu would be proud. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so this is a question around different types of organisations. We're talking a lot about constituents as being an audience, where you are presenting work and you have access to an audience. That don't. Say there's a particular contemporary music service organisation. They're not a presenting organisation. That said, they do present a couple of events during the year, but they are largely free. So we've kind of addressed that audience section, but their question is more around, they think their case for support is harder to define. Any tips for service organisations, I guess, and their case for support?
Yeah, service organisations and anything that you might consider to be upstream from the coalface they're not as immediately compelling. So it's a good question, I think. But that element of service, I think we need to build awareness of it. So it's a marketing and a communications issue, perhaps more than a fundraising one. And I think it's about making sure that how you are positioned to make people understand the leverage that you provide and where the whole ecology would be if you weren't there. That's your case for support. And so building through that, and I often say with people when you're sort of sitting down and saying, what's your case for support? Write a manifesto. It's a manifesto. It's a stake in the ground that says we are so important because, and turn that into your communication, because we all believe it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be getting up in the morning and coming into work. But what is that? Why are we so important? Now, start telling people who are the constituencies who may give you money as well. I mean, again, we can all tell our friends, but our friends might not be our future donors. So who are the people that you can get to? So you need to map your networks and then make sure, how do you position yourselves in those networks so that they understand you are in the business of receiving money and spending it wisely. And your case for support is how we would spend it wisely to enable the whole ecology to work better.
And the other thing that we talk about a lot with case for support is to test it. To talk to those constituents who you would be approaching for money, but also those who you impact.
Well, in fact, that's a perfect segue into you've got impact tattooed on one arm, you need, on the other arm, you need, if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. And so when we have a case of support, it is not about something that is a pitch. How do we pitch this and get money for it? It's how do we start a conversation with it? And so I think the strategy isn't to pitch your case of support, it's to socialize it and start to talk to our people about it, saying this is the case for support is this is where we want to go, this is why we're important, this is how we propose to get. What do you think? Because you're actually saying we can't get there without people like you. So if it doesn't make sense to you, it's not going to make sense to new people. Socialize your thinking. That's the strategy.
That's a great idea. I'm aware of time. I've got 5 more minutes. There's a couple of questions. The second last one I'll go to is you mentioned that there's more ads for fundraisers than there are fundraisers. And these conversations we have with a lot of organisations. So the question is around, as development positions are hard to fill, would you recommend choosing an organised person with no experience who is also good with people? Risky, but they can't afford an expensive development manager, and the current staff are stretched. They want to invest in a role. I guess, how would you recommend approaching recruiting for a fundraiser in that sort of scenario?
I think that's a really sensible approach. We often say look for attributes and transferable skills. And up until fairly recently, I'd never met anybody who, when they were growing up, says, when I grow up, I want to be a fundraiser.
No, Frankie? Really?
No, I was going to be a lawyer. And, but so it is about an attribute, a set of attributes and the discipline and the focus and the whatever. And in fact, many people who've come into fundraising, in a way, I mean, you're talking Louise Walsh, you're talking Louise Heron, CEO of Sydney Opera House, you're talking a good number of people I work with at Monash Uni, Melbourne Uni. They didn't start out, some of them started out in private banking, some of them in hospitality, some of them have come over from politics. There's all sorts of different ways and different skill sets. And but they make the fundraising profession stronger. And that's the way it grows, really.
So true. And I've actually seen some of the best fundraisers have come out of your training organisation. Your young musicians who are moving into arts administration, or ex-performers who have retired and love the art form and have the personal skills and attended donor events. Yeah. Just need to train them up with admin.
Yeah.
There's the passion, I think, and the attributes are so critical.
Yes.
Last question. I think your Betty Amsden example has really resonated with a lot of people. We don't have that much time. I think the question is more, can you expand a bit more on the Betty case study, but in particular, how did she become more involved? Was it that, did she initiate the relationship, or did the Arts Centre reach out to her in that first instance?
Yeah, that's a lovely way to finish. Betty started to get involved, or actually just to go to the arts. I think she'd spent, her career. She said she spent, the first 6 years of her life sort of growing a career and making money. Then she retired and was like, what do I do now? And she started to go to the arts. She joined the Arts Centre as a member initially. And Sue Mattress, who was the then CEO, met her at a member function and said, oh, you might be interested in getting involved as a donor. And so introduced her to the patrons manager at the time, a lady called Dinny Downey, who's fabulous, and they were a real duo. They worked well together. And so from there on in, Betty's relationship, one way or another, over many years, from different fundraisers, myself included, was curated, if you like. So it was classic fundraising. People listened to what she had to say. We knew that she liked working with kids. We knew that she believed in the next generation. We knew that she believed in community and participation. We knew that she loved what she saw at the Arts Centre, but she didn't want to see the artist as high priest. She wanted to see the people and the people's creativity. So as programming team over years, identified this or that, or we want to do this or want to do that, the fundraiser development team would be going, oh, Betty would like that. And so we got her more involved. And I was part of it, but actually then Suzanne Williamson She was 5 or 6 years there, and she was the one who worked closely with Betty at the point that led to the big pledge. And that was 2008-9. So at that stage, Betty had been supporting the Arts Centre already for about 14 years. So
did you say 1-4?
1-4. So it evolved over time. Her understanding of what the Arts Centre and all that it can do, and all that she could do as using an arts centre as an inflection point in society, and the fundraisers and the programming team understanding that this donor is really interested in this, and let's get them more involved, and it became family. So it was textbook in some respects.
Oh, that's amazing, and it's a lovely, inspiring story to finish on. Comments from the chat have been, thank you, Frankie, inspiring, insightful. A really valuable session. And just a reminder to everyone that the recording will be shared along with a copy of the slides. And we'll also be asking for some of your feedback in that email. We'd love you all to complete it so we can officially tell Frankie how awesome she is. And just a reminder, this has been such an important reminder that there's no silver bullet, that there really is time and thought and an all of organisation approach. And I only wish that all marketing directors were on this call so they could hear the same message and help drive the philanthropic message home. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Frankie. It's been a really wonderful hour and a half. I hope you've all taken a lot from it. Our next session is on the 21st of October with the wonderful Tammy Zonka from America. We'll be looking at the major gift journey. So taking what sort of Frankie's talked about and really focusing on that major gift cycle, how to get that first meeting and how to make the ask. In the meantime, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Frankie, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.